Hi everyone, and welcome to the second round of the FIDE Candidates Tournament in Madrid. In this video we'll have a look at all of the games that were played today. Before this round, Fabiano-Caruana and Jan-Nepomniachtchi were in the lead with 1 point out of one game, and they were playing each other in this round. So let's have a look and see what happened. Well, the first game that finished in this round was the game between Jan-Krzysztof Duda and Ding Liren. So Duda opened the game with 1 e4, e5 by Ding. This is his usual response. Knight f3, knight c6, and here a bit of a surprise by Duda. I was expecting him to go for the reload pass. That's really his bread and butter. But in this game he goes for bishop to c4. Knight f6 by Ding. He's inviting the fried liver, but Duda decides to keep it more quiet with the move d3. Now here there's a lot of things black can do. Black can play pawn h6, bishop e7, or the more conventional bishop to c5. And Ding played bishop c5, c3, and played d6. Black can also play for d5 in these lines, getting more control over the center, but d6 is very solid as well. So short castles, rook to e1, and the move a5. Now, traditionally, black always put their pawn on a6, but, black can also decide to put this pawn on a5 to gain more space on that side of the board. The bishop can still drop back to this square. Anyway, Duda played pawn h3, h6 by Ding, making sure there's never any bishop g5 stuff. So knight b2 was played, and now bishop e6. And the point behind the move a5 is that if white takes and black recaptures, white cannot gain more space with the move b4. So all very, very subtle. But Duda played bishop e5. This is of course the drawback of the move a5. If your pawn would be here, white would not have this move available. And now Ding comes up with a very surprising move. He plays the move queen to b8, which, as I said, might come as a surprise to many of you, but the point is to put the queen on a7, hit this pawn over here, and there's also sometimes the idea of playing the move a5, a4. So Duda goes knight f1, but the drawback of bringing this queen here is that, you have less defenders around your king, but it's not that easy for white to launch an attack towards the black king. So queen a7, hitting f2, so Duda is forced to go rook e2, and now Ding goes a4. So he's cutting off the escape route of this bishop, so Duda goes knight g3 and queen a5. So white is forced to give up the bishop here for the knight. I mean, there's no other move. I mean, if you take... No, wait. You have to do that. I mean, if you go here, then this pawn on c4 is going to become quite weak. So you have to take on c6, and black recaptures. And now here, things can get very sharp if white goes for something like knight h4, brings knight on f5. That's of course a drawback of bringing this queen out to a5, is that, once again, your king has less protection. But Duda played another move. He played the move bishop to d2. So keeping an eye on the queen, potentially. Maybe d4 could be an idea, so that after the trade you hit the queen. So Ding played bishop b6 preemptively. Alright, queen to c2 by Duda. I thought a move like queen c1 would also make a lot of sense, trying to sack over here, but of course black always goes king h7 to make sure that that doesn't happen. Alright, but queen to c2 by Duda, king h7 by Ding, c4 by white, queen to a7, bishop c3, and now Ding came up with another very surprising maneuver. He played the move knight to g8, so he's undeveloping his own knight. But the point is to bring the knight to e7 and try to play f5 eventually, and then the power of the two bishops will be more felt. And here Duda missed a nice chance for an advantage. In this position, he should have played the move b4. Not easy to see, but we'll see the point soon. It's a nice move. White can try to go c5 in some positions to try to shut out this bishop. And let's say black takes and goes queen to b7. White has a very nice sequence. First we trade off the rooks on a8, then we go d4 to push in the center. Now black never really wants to go this, because you can always hit by e5 push and your king is in check. So if you go f6, then white goes c5, hitting this bishop, and after bishop a7, b4, white has quite a nice advantage, because your bishop on a7 is very passive. It's very difficult to break up this pawn chain in the center, and black is, for the moment, down a piece almost. With this bishop over there, it's hard to make its way back into the game. But Duda played the move rook to d2, perhaps preparing the move d4, and here Ding played a very instructive move, which looks very weird at first sight. He played the move c5. Now you might be wondering, like, what is this? He's shutting out his own bishop, like, this is just so bad. But the point is, black is stopping d4 forever, and black can later go c6, bring this bishop back around through d8, maybe can come out to g5 or f6, let's say, and it's supporting these pushes on the king side. And also it's stopping the b4 push, so it was a really good move by Ding. Duda goes rook to f1, so Duda thinks like, okay, the center is now locked up, the queen side is locked up, I'm gonna shift my attention to the king side and prepare an eventual f4 break. So then goes c6, knight h2, and f6. Now white can go f4, but it doesn't really concern black. So rook d2 was played by Duda, queen to d7, bringing more pieces over to the king side, bishop d2, so Duda is ready to go f4 here, which is why Ding plays the move g5, which I'm not quite sure if it was the right move, because it does weaken quite a lot of squares over here. Perhaps he should have just played the move knight e7. I mean, white can go for the move f4, but if you take, and then let's say you go knight g6 to e5, it still feels like black has quite a comfortable position. You can also follow it up by d5 at the right moment, but it's a complicated game. But anyway, g5 by Ding also makes sense. But now rook b1, a very good, nice move by Duda. He realizes like, okay, f4 is no longer possible. I want to prepare to move b4, open this file for my rook, and he's vacating the f1 square for his knight to come back here, here, and then jump into f5. So knight e7 was played by Ding, pawn b4 by Duda. Ding takes en croissant, and Duda recaptures with the rook. So he wants to take control over the b file. Bishop c7 was played. And now bishop e3. Ding played queen e8, bring his queen closer to the king side. But this did allow the move rook to b7, hitting bishop over here. So it's a little bit annoying. So he played queen to d8. And now came queen d1, another nice move by Duda. He wants to shift his rook over to the b file as well. And then, you know, maybe try to infiltrate with the queen and the knights over here. So Ding played bishop c8, telling that rook like, hey, GTFO. Rook to b3, queen e8, rook eb2. Queen g6, and now Duda played knight h-f1. Right, so he's really maneuvering his pieces very nicely. And it's tough for black to do anything, because your bishop can never leave the square, because then rook b7 will be tough to deal with. So he played rook to f7, now came queen e2, and king g8, bishop d2 by Duda. It felt like here the players are just shuffling back and forth, and if white can get a knight e3, then f5 will always be very difficult for black to achieve. But now Ding played the move f5. This was well timed. He put this rook here first and the king back, so rook b7 didn't really concern him too much later on. So we saw a trade. Ding recaptures. White took in f5. Black recaptured. Knight g3, hitting the bishop. The bishop dropped back to c8. Now bishop to e3 by Duda, proving this bishop just a little bit. King g7. And now Duda was probably better in this position. Maybe he should have played something along the lines of f3. And it's difficult for black to come up with a move here. You don't really want to go h5. Then you weaken the g5 pawn. So it feels like the only one who can try to create some problems here is probably white. But the position is very locked up. I mean, maybe you have to go knight e4, knight e4 and so knight e4 in some position. Maybe bring the queen around the g3, maybe h4. Very slowly try to chip away at the black king side, but it's all kind of slow. But instead of that, Duda gave a check. Ding went back. He went knight back, king up, check. King g8, and the game ended in a draw. So Ding moves to a half point out of 2 games. Duda moves to 1. But once again, it felt like Duda could have played on a little bit. Alright, so let's move on to the next game. The next game to finish was the game between the two leaders, Jan Nepomniachtchi and Fabiano Caruana. So Fabiano won his first game with the white pieces, and everyone expected him to, you know, play it solid with black, because that's how you do it at the candidates, right? You try to put pressure with white, and you try to be solid with black. But let's have a look at what happened. So Nepo opened the game with his bread and butter, e4, e5 by Fabiano, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to c4, knight f6 by Fabiano. So he's also inviting the fried liver, but apparently at the top level, the fried liver is completely fine for black, and Jan just played the move d3. Fabiano played bishop c5, castles, d6, c3, and we saw earlier that Ding went for the move a5, but Fabiano goes for the move a6. a4 by Nepo, and bishop a7. So keeping a lot of options open. Rook to e1, h6. Now Nepo keeps developing with the move knight bd2. You know, he was thinking maybe the game will develop quietly after castles, but Fabiano all of a sudden unleashed g5. He's making his intentions very clear. He wants to go after the white king. You know, maybe start pushing these pawns on the king side. And the move g5 was a little bit surprising, because usually black plays this move if white plays h3 early on. Right, generally, as a rule of thumb, you should not play h3 in the tie-in if your opponent has not castled yet, because here black can play g5 very comfortably and use this pawn on h3 as a hook to open up files towards your king. Anyway, So knight b2 was played, g5 by Fabiano anyway, and now Nepo goes b4. So with the move b4, he enables himself to create counterplay on the queen side and in the center, and now Fabiano went for another surprising move. He played knight to g4, so he's creating a very direct threat towards opponent f2, but I mean, white can just protect it with the move rook e2, and now comes queen to f6. So queen f6 creates another threat, because if white plays, let's say, knight f1, which looks very logical, black goes knight takes f2. White has to recapture, then we take an f2, we bring the king out to f2, and then we go pawn g4, and we're gonna win back the knight, so black will be up in exchange. So this is black's idea with behind the move queen f6, which is why Nepo played queen e1. Alright, so if you take now, white takes, and we take with the queen. Right, so white is winning. White is winning. White has 2 pieces for the rook and has much better coordination. So Fabiano played queen g7, and up to this point Fabiano was still playing very, very quickly. Knight f1 by Nepo, castles blitzed out by Fabiano, knight g3, knight e7, once again still blitzed out, and I believe d4 was played by Nepo, and Fabiano here also played very quickly. Pawn takes d4, pawn takes, and knight c6. So now all of a sudden, white felt that he had to create something in the center, right? But his pawn center is just very loose, and there's just no way for white to protect his pawn on d4. Now here bishop e2 was the move I was expecting, but Nepo played rook to a3. So he's saying like, okay, you can take this pawn over here, but his hope is to later swing this rook over to the king side and create some sort of attack. But it's not easy, because black is pretty solid. This bishop can come out to e6, you know, this knight can hop back to e5, and it's not easy to see what white's counterplay is exactly. But Nepo played h3, hitting this knight, knight e5 by Fabiano, and bishop a2. Now, here I thought that Fabiano was going to play something like bishop e6, trying to trade off these bishops and just bring more pieces into the game. Maybe this rook will come out to e8. But he played move c5, also an excellent move, a very good move. Nepo took. So his idea is to go pawn c4, maybe at some point, to try to shut out this bishop, or, you know, threaten to take, and then followed up by bishop c5, hitting the queen and the rook on a3. So Nepo took, Fabiano recaptured the bishop, hitting the rook, rook to b3, and now pawn b5. A good move by Fabiano, because if you take, now your bishop on a2 will be under attack, so you have to address that first. So Nepo played knight f5. Now Fabiano decided to not take this knight right away, which was slightly surprising, but it is understandable, because white will recapture. He will also have some pressure towards the knight at some point, maybe rook g3. Things get very, very sharp here. So Fabiano decided to just go queen to f6 and just keep the situation as is. King h2 by Nepo. He wants to enable himself to go for pawn f4 and hit the knight and rip open the king side. Pawn takes h4, pawn takes a4 by Fabiano, and rook to g3. Bring more pieces over to the king side. King h7, and now queen d1 by Nepo. So I'm a little bit surprised by this move. I wonder what exactly the point was. But maybe he just wanted to hit this pawn over here, which is why Fabiano played bishop d7, and now came rook c2 by Nepo. So he's creating some threats over here. It's not exactly clear what, maybe f4 still at some point. But here Fabiano decided to take the knight on f5. White recaptured, and he played rook to b8. But perhaps this move was a little bit too slow. It doesn't really do too much. I mean, maybe he should have just brought his rook over to let's say, e8, to bring more defenders towards his king. But rook ab8 was played. Now queen h5 by Nepo. Rook g8, because this pawn is under attack. So rook g8, now king bishop e2. And things are not easy. White is hitting this knight on e5, which is protecting this pawn over here. If you were to take with the pawn, then you hang your bishop. So here, perhaps Fabiano could have sacrificed the exchange and go a3. Because black has pretty nice compensation because he controls a lot of the dark squares. And it's difficult for white to really break through on this side of the board. But Fabiano decided to go rook ge8, adding another defender to the knight on e5. But now bishop c1 by Nepo, you have to go back to g8, bishop b2, and yeah, once again, he could have sacked the exchange, but they just went for this repetition. So a draw between the two leaders, Jan Nepomniachtchi and Fabiano Caruana. They each move on to 1.5 out of 2. Alright, so let's move on to this game between Richard Rapport and Alireza Firouzja. I mean, this game could really go either way. Both players are very aggressive, very creative, so let's have a look at what happened. Well, to me the first move was already a surprise. Richard generally is more of a d4 player, but in this game he opened the game up with the move 1 e4. And Alireza, he's shown once again that he doesn't want to play solid, he really wants to fight for first place. You know, I was expecting him to go pawn e5. But here he goes for the Sicilian, so knight f3, d6, perhaps he wanted to go into a knight off, so Richard goes d4, takes, and Richard takes with the queen, which is a bit of a sideline. Now I have some experience in this line, especially from the black side, and I've usually played the move knight on f6, but Alireza goes for another line, which I've also played quite a bit, knight c6, bishop b5. Now here, traditionally, bishop d7 had always been the main move, but he goes for the move a6. So he's basically inviting the straight on c6, and they get an interesting position. Right, black has the two bishops and potentially has more control in the center, but white has a lead in development. Anyway, white went pawn c4, e5, queen d3, and here, you know, knight f6 is sort of the standard move from black, but Alireza played knight e7, and this allows white to go pawn c5 to break up the pawn structure here on the queen side and in the middle. It's very similar to what Duda did with white when Richard played with the black pieces in the first round. You know, he also played c5, bringing up the structure. Problem for black is you can give a check over here to hit this, but white can just go queen c3. And the endgame, the problems remain in the endgame. So Alireza played knight to g6, but now white just took. Take, take, take. And we get into this endgame where once again black has the two bishops, but white has a slightly better pawn structure, right? The pawns on b2 and a2 are connected, and the pawns on c6 and a6 are split. So bishop e3 by Rapport, a5 by Alireza, good move. He's enabling himself to bring this bishop out into the game. Castles by Rapport, f6 by Alireza, which was perhaps a little bit too slow. I mean, maybe he wanted to put the bishop here and not be bothered by knight g5. I guess that was the idea. So Richard played rook c1, hitting this pawn very directly. Rook a6 by Alireza, knight b2, and now bishop e6. Alright, so Richard played knight e1. He wants to go for this knight maneuver like knight d3 to c5. So Alireza played king f7, knight d3, and rook to d8. Now Richard played king f1, bringing his king closer to the center. That's generally what you want to do in the endgame. Alireza played bishop b4, which, I don't know, I felt like this was a bit of a mistake because black is creating this threat on the knight, but it's very easy to parry, and then you always have to reckon with white taking this bishop on b4. So Rapport played king e2, now knight h4 by Alireza, also looked like a bit of a weird move. Now the point is that if white plays pawn on g3, black has a lot of tactics connected with bishop g4 check, f3 you take here, and then you take on f3, and the position just sort of collapses. So Rapport took on b4, black recaptured, but now g3, and black is losing a lot of time just to induce this trade, but this trade isn't necessarily good for black. Knight g6 back, and now bishop c5. And the problem for black is that if you were to take on a2, let's say with the bishop right now, white can always play b3 and try to trap your bishop. So you don't really want to do that. Instead of that, Alireza played rook b8, but now Rapport did something very smart. He played the move a3. He traded over here, and he took with the rook. And the problem is, if black takes over here, white's going to take with the pawn and have this very unpleasant outside passer. But especially, you know, supported by the bishop, supported by the rook. And black has this pass pawn on c5, which is not going anywhere. So white still has a nice advantage. So rook b8 was played by Alireza. Now knight is c4 by Richard. He wants to hop in with the knight either to d6 or maybe b6. So trade happened on c4 and knight of 8 to bring the knight around to e6, perhaps d4. So once again, Richard is hoping that black will take, as then he takes with the a-pawn. But here he decided, like, okay, if you don't want to trade, that's fine. And he played rook b3 to activate this rook. Black cannot stop rook b7. So knight e6 by Alireza, rook b7 check, king g8. Now came bishop d3 back, and rook d8 by Alireza, activating the rook on the other open file. And here, f4. A very nice move by Richard. He wants to be able to go f5, kick this knight away, which is holding together a lot of squares. Right? It's defending the g7 pawn if a rook were to land on a 7 rank. And if black trades on f4, that also doesn't really help. Now f5 is still going to come. So Alireza decided to go knight to d4. Richard took and played king d2. And around here it started to look really good for Richard. He has this very active rook on b7. Black has these, they're not isolated, they're connected, but they're kind of split. He has those weaknesses on c6 and d4. white can potentially create a passer later on. So all the ingredients for an unpleasant endgame for Alireza, and he decided not to wait passively with a move like h6 or maybe h5, but he went for active counterplay with rook a1. But the question is if this works out. Richard decided to take the pawn on c6 and rook h1 by Alireza, going after the pawn on h2. But now came rook c7, black takes, king d3, and at first sight it looks like white is winning, right? White is just cleaning up the 7 rank, but black still has this move g6. And notice how this rook is defending this pawn over here. So Richard played pawn e5, creating that passer in the center, takes and rook h3 by Alireza, hitting the pawn on g3 and making sure that this pawn on h7 is still protected. So king e4 by Richard. He's making sure that the rook takes g3 does not come with a check, but black doesn't have anything better, so Alireza decided to take this pawn anyway. But now came a check, king h8, and white picks up this pawn with a check, and the position becomes extremely unpleasant for Alireza. King to g8, king f4, but to his credit, Alireza played amazingly well. It looks very tough to defend here, but rook e3 was the best move. You cannot allow this pawn to pass through. So Richard gave a check, king f8, and around here, Richard started going wrong. The win is extremely difficult. I tried figuring it out with the computer, but even then I got very confused. But apparently the way to go is rook to c7, you throw in checkmate, so the king steps back. We give another check. And after king h8, now you go rook ge7. With the idea that you want to go e6. And now your rook protected, you pushed this king into the corner first, so it's further away from the pawn. And if this king were to go to f8, then white goes for pawn b4. Once again, all very difficult stuff, but one way or another white is winning. But good luck figuring this out over the board. But instead of that, Richard gave a check on f7. The king went back to g8. He repeated moves, repeated move once again, gave a check, and now rook takes g6. And with this move, he's probably already throwing away a big chunk of his advantage. Alireza played rook e2, a good move, hitting the pawn of b2, but more importantly, threatening rook f2. So e6 was played, but now came rook e8, and you can't defend this pawn on e6. And without that pawn, you simply cannot win, because the b pawn alone is not enough. So Richard gave 2 checks to repeat the position, but now he played rook f6. But now, he doesn't have the rooks on the 7 rank anymore, so it's very difficult to create any threats towards the black king. Rook e7 by Alireza. He wants to be able to go king up, and maybe this move gave Richard some new chances. Here Richard could have played the move king f5, which makes things very tricky for black. You're threatening to go rook h6 in some variations, or rook g3, and if d2, apparently you give a check, rook h7. Well, it just I don't know, the evil bar keeps changing. It's very difficult to figure out whether white is winning or not, but maybe king f5 was a better try for Richard. But anyway, it just shows how difficult this endgame is. b4 was played, but now Alireza sets his pawn in motion, rook g3, d2, and the problem is black is using this d pawn as a decoy, right? White will have to move one of his rooks out of the way, and then eventually black is going to capture his pawn e6, and the king will eventually make its way back to the queen side. And a rook and pawn versus rook endgame is just quite an elementary draw. So a check was given on h6, rook h7, take, rook d3 to stop this pawn. But now a very nice move by Alireza. He goes king g6, bringing his king closer to the queen side first, and making sure that, white cannot do anything yet, because his king cannot go up. So king f3 was played by Richard, but now black just took, and after rook takes d2, king to f6, king f4, rook e1, rook d4, and king e6. And there's simply nothing white can do. His own king is cut off as well. If you go b5, there will be rook b1, you pick up this pawn, and the pawn endgame is just a draw if white trades the rooks, because black just walks his king over to the queen side. So after king to e6, the players just agreed to a draw. So big save by Alireza. Could have easily lost this game, but as it stands, he's still on 50%. He got 2 tough black games out of the way, so let's see how he will do with white. And for Richard, it was a missed opportunity. He draws his game with the white pieces and moves to 1 out of 2 as well. Alright, so let's move on to the last game between Hikaru Nakamura and Teimour-Radjabov. Hikaru had that very unfortunate loss yesterday with the black piece against Fabiano Caruana. He got a completely fine position out of the opening, but then he made the inexplicable mistake of castling kingside. So let's see how he's going to try to come back today. So he opened the game up with 1 e4. e5 by Radjabov. You know, Radjabov generally tries to play it very solid with the black pieces. Knight f3 by Hikaru, knight c6, bishop b5, and knight f6. So this could have been expected. Radjabov generally plays the Berlin defense. d3 by Hikaru, bishop c5 by Radjabov, and here perhaps a little bit of a surprise by Hikaru. In the Norway chess tournament, both Wesley So and Anish Giri with the white pieces played the move c3, and Radjabov got into trouble very early on. Against Wesley So he castled, and after castle he played the line with d5. But after knight b2 he wasn't able to equalize, you know, completely, and eventually lost. And against Anish Giri he played the move d6, which is known to be not to be the right move. White went d4, takes, and after bishop b4 after the straight, white had a pleasant advantage. But Hikaru decides to set a bit of a surprise with the move knight bd2. But by going knight bd2 first, you allow black going knight d4 because there's no pawn on c3. So now came the trade on d4, c3 by Hikaru to hit the bishop back, bishop b6, and here d4. So white is taking advantage of the fact that black cannot play d6 to hold the center, and so black has a decision to make here. If you take on d4, it looks like it's winning a pawn. Well, here white goes pawn e5 and hits the knight, and things get pretty sharp. Black can take another pawn. But once again, it felt like Radjabov was surprised very early on, so to go into all this sharp stuff without any preparation is really dangerous. So after d4, he played the other main line, which is to go c6. But this allows white to take an e5, you take on b5, white takes an f6, recapture. And so we have this position where black has the two bishops, but white has the better pawn structure. I mean, these pawns on b5 are doubled, and pawns on b5 are doubled, and you have an isolated d pawn. Alright, well, but in the meantime, it's important to note that black is threatening the throbbing mate on f2. So Hikaru played short castles and queen h5. I believe this was Hikaru's novelty. He's creating a very direct threat towards the pawn on b5. And if you go a6, the idea is very simple. You want to go knight f3, let's say d6 to go rook e1, bishop e3, and white has quite a pleasant advantage. Once again, white just has a better pawn structure. His pawn on d6 can become very weak later on. So Radjabov played the move queen to c6 after a lot of thought. He was already getting behind a lot on the clock, like 45 minutes, and Hikaru quickly played rook e1. He was still in his preparation, but now after Radjabov's next move, which was rook to e8, here Hikaru started to think on his own. But Hikaru did play the best move. He played knight to f3. And so the problem is that black cannot take an e4, because if you take an e4, white plays bishop d2, and there's simply too many threats. White wants to take here, there's knight g5, like let's say you go d5, there's knight g5. I hit this, and I hit this. And if you trade here first, queen g6 doesn't help because rook e8 is checkmate. Now, what happens if you go pawn h6? Well, if you go pawn h6, then we trade here first. Then we go rook e1, hit the queen, and white gives a check. And then it's a very nice knight g5, and black is forced to give the queen. So you cannot take this pawn on e4. So instead of that Radjabov, I expected him to play the move h6. You know, cutting out the move knight g5, and after bishop e3, go d6. And white is better, right? You have the better pawn structure, but black is still kind of solid. After a trade like this, black can try to get in the move b4, get rid of his, you know, doubled b pawns, and altogether it's not so bad. But he surprised everyone with the move d5. Alright, so a bit of a pawn sacrifice. I thought that here Hikaru probably should have taken with the queen. And they go into this endgame, where black has some compensation, but I don't know if black has quite enough. And after bishop 5, white is quite a nice way to solve the problem of the d pawn, which is to go a4, with the point being that if black trades, then you have this move c4 to defend this pawn on d5. But Hikaru played the move pawn takes, also makes a lot of sense. Radjabov traded, queen c4, threatening some ideas with bishop g4, so Hikaru played h3. Good move, also making some move for the king. Bishop d7 by Hikaru, by Radjabov. And here, Hikaru did play the best move, but I didn't quite like the fact that he spent so much time on it. He spent 30 minutes for queen f3, Radjabov played rook e8, and then he played bishop e3 after another 20 minutes, which was a bit surprising, because rook e8 is the most logical move. He's just spent 30 minutes, so I feel like he should have looked at bishop e3. And there's also no other move that really makes sense, because you don't want to allow rook to e2. Anyway, bishop e3 was played, takes, rook e5 by Radjabov, and here's where probably the extra time could have really helped him. In this position, black is hitting the pawn on d5. You cannot play e4 because that pawn would be hanging. But here white has a very nice move. White has the move rook d1. So you're sacrificing the pawn on a2, and here white has a very nice follow-up. White can go knight to d3, hitting this rook on e5. And black probably has to take this pawn over here. If you go rook f5, queen g3 is extremely strong. I throw in background checkmate. So, I mean, and if you go h6, then I keep my initiative with e4, then I can jump to c5, and black's just getting absolutely steamrolled in the center. Now, what happens if you decide to take this pawn on d5? Well, here white goes e4, hitting the rook. And if this rook goes to d6, there's a very elegant knight to c5. And the problem is that if you take on d1 and go bishop e8, white goes queen d8, hitting the bishop, and you cannot go king f8, because there's knight d7 check, and you take the bishop with checkmate. So very difficult all to calculate, but this would have been the best line for white. Unfortunately for Hikaru, he missed it. But let's see what he did. He played the move d6, which really gave away pretty much all of his advantage. Radjabov played queen to d5, which was probably a bit of an inaccuracy. Bishop c6 would have been the way to go. White can play d7, but here black can take, and after bishop c6, black still has a lot of compensation. You know, white's pieces are pretty passive. But queen e5 was played by Radjabov. Now, he is going to win back a pawn sooner or later, but white does keep the more active position. So rook d1 by Hikaru, takes. Now black gets his pawn back, but rook d5. There's still, you know, some problems to be solved here. Knight e5 is an idea, rook c5. So let's say go b6. So knight e5, you're losing the game because the bishop is under attack and d7 is coming through. So Radjabov played f6, stopping this knight from jumping in, and now Hikaru played rook c5. A nice move. He wants to go rook c7, and black cannot play bishop c6, because here you sacrifice the exchange to go d7. There's no rook e8, and after rook d3, there's knight d4, blocking of the rook, and you're going to get a new queen and win the game. Alright, so instead of that, Radjabov played rook e6. He's still just in time. Rook c7 took the pawn, Hikaru took here, and Radjabov played a6. So, as I was following this game online, I felt like, okay, white is still a tiny bit better. He has the more active rook. He can put his knight on d4 on a nice anchor square. It can also not be challenged by any of black's pawns. So white's definitely better. But how is white ever going to make progress? And here, I thought, here Radjabov did make a bit of a mistake. He should have played the move g5 to set his kingside pawns in motion, and then maybe h5, h4. But he started with the move h5, and this allowed Hikaru to go pawn h4. So now he's getting his pawns fixed on the dark squares rather than on the light squares, right? Which is the square, which is the color of Radjabov's bishop. So g5, but g3, and it's really difficult for black ever to use his pawn majority. So king f7, king f2, king g6, king e3, and it's also difficult for black to make a move. And on top of all of those small problems, Radjabov was also getting very low on the clock. So he played rook to d5, rook a7 by Hikaru, rook d6, b3 by Hikaru, trying to create a passer here on the c file, bishop b6 to stop that plan, but now rook c7. And here, being low on the clock, Radjabov probably made a serious mistake. He played rook to d5. Now, the idea is that if white takes, there's rook e5 and you hold the balance, but the move rook d5 is very risky because it gives white the opportunity to go rook c6, hit this bishop and the pawn on a6. So black will probably create some counterplay on the king side because he has a majority over there, can often take and then go after the h-pawn. But it feels like white should be faster on the queen side. So Radjabov gave a check, king f2, and he played bishop to d7. Hikaru took the pawn and he took on h4 and rook e4. But now came rook to d6, hitting the bishop. And it's very awkward to find a place for this bishop. If you go to e8, there's rook e6. And if white gets a trade of the rooks, white is just winning. Perhaps in one of those lines, maybe Radjabov missed that he cannot play king f5 because there's always knight g7. I don't know exactly what he missed, but he was low on time and nobody's a hero in time pressure. So he played bishop c8. Now came rook d8, hitting the bishop. And actually bishop c8 was move 40. So now, you know, he gets an extra hour on the clock. He can breathe, but the problems continue. So he played bishop g4, rook d5, going after this pawn on b5, which is very tough to defend. Bishop c8, rook c5, hitting the bishop once more. Bishop d7, rook c7, bishop e8. Now there's no rook e6. So it feels like, you know, black has weaseled out of this a little bit. And white needs to make a passive move, which is what Hikaru did with knight to f3. But still, this bishop on e8 is very difficult to use, right? Because it's kind of dominated by the white rook. So rook e6 was played. He wants to go rook to a6 and go after this pawn. That's why Hikaru played rook a7, rook e4, rook a8, king f7, rook d8, rook e7, and rook d2. Bring this rook back. Rook e4 and rook d5. Another nice move. King g6 and a3. So slowly but surely Hikaru is trying to make little bits of progress. Rook e7, and now he goes knight e4. So he wants to go after this pawn, after which he will have a 3 versus 0 majority on the queen side. Black can go after this pawn, which is what he did. And black has a 2 versus 0 majority, but the pawns are not connected, so it's more difficult to push them up the board. But of course the position still remains very tricky. Knight d4 by Hikaru. Rook h2 check, king g3, and rook d2. But now Hikaru sets his pawn in motion with the move c4. And it's very difficult to stop the c pawn. The a pawn can also start running. So Radjabov gave a check. Now king h4, making sure that this h pawn is not going anywhere. And after bishop f7, rook d8. And once again, black's pieces are just so stuck on the king side that it's so difficult for him to do anything. So he played rook to d1, a4 by Hikaru, and now rook h1 check, king g3 and h4. So he finally gets his pawn rolling. And here's where Hikaru probably made a slight inaccuracy, but it was very difficult to figure out exactly why. Apparently the best move here would have been the move king f4, but to step your king away from the passed pawn, black can go rook g1, cutting your king off. It seems a little counterintuitive. So the move Hikaru played looks the most natural. He played the move king g2, and here's probably where, Radjabov missed, maybe one of his last chances to hold on. He should have played the move rook b1. And the idea is that white cannot play c5 because you hang your pawn on b3. And you can play the move a5, but now black activates his king. And with the king coming to g4, there will be rook b2, so altogether it's pretty tricky. But instead of that, he went to c1, now came a5, and he played king h5. So he wants to activate the kings, get the pawn rolling, but here Hikaru played a very accurate move. He played the move king f2. To make sure that king g4 doesn't really come with any punch, so to speak, because h3 will no longer be a check. If black goes h3 here, we can go king g3, and we have the pawn firmly under control. So Radjabov played king g4, but now came rook f8. A nice move by Hikaru, hitting the bishop, and if the bishop moves, the pawn on f6 will be hanging. And once again, it's very difficult to find a square for this bishop in the first place. So Radjabov played h3, sacrificing the bishop, but this simply doesn't work. Hikaru took h2, but the question is how, right? Like, how do we stop this h-pawn? Because if you go rook h7, well, then you give up your rook for the pawn, and is that winning with these passes over here? I mean, maybe it is, but very difficult to figure out. But Hikaru found a much easier way. He gave a check, king f4, knight e2. The problem is if you go to the h file, there will just be a check over here, and you can collect the pawn. So king f4 is forced, knight e2, king e5, and now knight g3. He stops the h-pawn with his knight. So rook to c2 check, king f3, rook c3, king g2, and now if black takes, we take with a rook, and our king stops the pawn. So Radjabov took the pawn on b3, but now Hikaru went a6, and this pawn is simply gonna decide the game. Radjabov played rook a3, a7, and after king to d4, Hikaru played the very nice knight f5 check, sacrificing this pawn on c4, but now he played rook to b7, cutting off the king from coming to the b file, and after king c5, the very nice knight e7. So his idea is he wants to put the knight on c8, defend this pawn, so then he can go rook to b8, and there's simply nothing black can do. Black will always be too late if he goes for his own counterplay, moves like f5, because knight c8, f4, and once again, white is just faster. We queen this pawn, and at the end of it all, we have rook a1, and white wins. So because of that, after knight e7, Radjabov resigned. So Hikaru moves back to 50%, 1 point out of 2 games. He still has all the chances, to win the candidate's tournament. And tomorrow, he will be playing Alireza Firouzja with the black piece. That's definitely going to be a very exciting pairing. But in any case, I hope you guys all enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing y'all in the next one.